Right, good afternoon. Welcome back to this meeting of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. I'm delighted to say we are joined this afternoon by Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz, can you hear me this afternoon?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Well, morning. Good morning where you are. So thank you.
Good morning. It's a rainy morning in New York.
Thank you for taking the time to join the committee. I should introduce myself. My name is Murdo Fraser. I'm convener of the committee, and I'm joined here by a number of colleagues. And we are keen to talk to you today around the issue of alternatives to GDP as a measure of economic success and progress. Now, I think before we get into questions, Professor Stiglitz, I think you were keen to say something by way of an introduction.
Sure. Let me begin. First, let me say I'm delighted to be here to talk to you. My work with the International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress has underlined the concerns over the adequacy of gross domestic product as a measure of well-being. I hope my remarks today will provide further impetus for the work done in Scotland to improve and implement better measures of performance. This is important because what we measure affects what we do. If a country assesses success by the wrong measures, it is likely to do the wrong things. Metrics like GDP are part of our information system, and information systems guide how we steer the economy. That GDP was not a good measure of well-being has long been recognized. Simon Kuznets, widely credited with creating our system of national accounts, was aware of the limitations. In 1934, he commented, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income." Yet, as our report pointed out, while changes in our economy and our society meant that GDP or GNP was increasingly inadequate, even as a measure of market activity, it was increasingly relied upon as a measure of performance. 34 years later, Robert Kennedy would remark in a cogent criticism of what was wrong with it as a measure. It measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Since then, these warnings have been ignored as GDP and GNP have become even more central to our measurement of success. In performance-oriented societies, we want metrics, and GDP and GNP provide such a metric. But since Kennedy's time, matters have become worse, both because of changes in our technology and because we have shifted focus from GNP to GDP, centered on measuring the goods produced within a country, not even the incomes of the citizens of a country. We have been pleased at the reception that our report has received, and research efforts and policy initiatives which it encouraged and spawned. We had hoped, for instance, that our report would spur not only research, but a framework around which there could be a more meaningful discussion of societal objectives with a broader engagement of civil society. We have said that wider open and public discussion will be crucial. Let me commend Scotland for the several efforts that are going on here to develop better measures of performance. Under the aegis of, for instance, of the Carnegie UK Trust, it created a roundtable on measuring economic performance and social progress in Scotland. And its report, More Than GDP, Measuring What Matters, uses the template of our report to review both the success of Scotland and the extent to which government was being held accountable in performing its role in contributing to Scotland's success. A number of observations it made highlight the points of our original report. Put simply, GDP measures the busyness of our economy. But is it a growing economy busy doing the right things? Making our economy do more will not necessarily lead to the things we want. It also said, our over-reliance on GDP makes it difficult for politicians to back policies that are good for society and the environment, but which might hamper an increase in GDP. In reviewing the Scottish attempts to assess its performance in a way that goes well beyond GDP, it observed, quote, "The most important fact about the National Performance Framework is that it exists. The innovative work in thinking and developing it deserves praise." It emphasized the need for indicators of performance, both for the government and society more broadly, but that it was also critical that measurements help move Scotland towards its end goals. In effect, it recognized that many of those goals lie outside the traditional market economy, and that even those goals that were within the market economy are not necessarily well valued by prices, and the price system, and therefore are not incorporated accurately into GDP. A standard theorem in economics is that when the price system works well, it can be used for efficient decentralization. A standard problem within the public sector, however, is how to decentralize and devolve responsibility. There is a belief that such decentralization may lead to better delivery of public services, but that will only be true if those delivering public services have the right incentives. Problems of agency delegation are pervasive. And if, as we in the Scottish report emphasize, the price system provides an inadequate framework for delegation and decentralization, something else must be put in its stead. Scotland's report is an attempt to do this. I am particularly pleased that a lively discussion has emerged in Scotland over the critical question of what does matter and how best to capture it in our metrics. This was exactly what the Commission hoped would follow from our report. We hoped that not just better metrics would emerge, but a stronger public awareness and a more vibrant public dialogue on these issues that we believed should be at the center of our society's concerns. Oxfam's Humankind Index, done with the New Economics Foundation, the Fraser Allander Institute, is another commendable example, although I do not want to comment now on their recommendations. There are, however, 5 general observations that I want to leave you with in conclusion. First, technical matters are important. If they are not addressed, our metrics can be misleading. One of the 3 working groups of the Commission delved deeply into this issue, and I hope that Scotland will provide support for continued work improving our measures. Second, distribution matters. What is relevant is not just how a country does on average, but how the benefits are distributed. My recent book, The Price of Inequality, has emphasized the many dimensions of inequality and how these are increasing in most countries around the world. I argue that we pay a high price for this inequality. It weakens our economy, undermines our democracy, and divides our society. An economy in which GDP is going up, but most citizens' income is going down, such as the United States, is not a successful economy. An emphasis on GDP might lead one to conclude otherwise. Third, sustainability is vital in every respect: environmental, economic, political, and social. America experienced growth in the early years of this century, but it was a false prosperity. It was not sustainable. But even worse, the seeming prosperity of the West is not environmentally sustainable. We will have to learn to live within the confines of our planet's limited resources. We cannot ignore global warming. Again, I want to commend the work of the Scottish Government in this arena. Fourthly, what we care about is well-being, broadly defined. Material goods are a means to an end, not an end in themselves. We are fortunate enough in the 21st century to have more than enough goods to meet the basic needs of everyone if the goods were fairly distributed. But the way we organize our society may leave many with insecurity, many isolated, may lead to a poorer environment, a divided society with more inequality. Finally, I want to return to the central theme I raised earlier. My hope was that the Commission would give rise to a dialogue around the world on what really matters, and that this dialogue in turn would become an instrument for creating a better society in which more individuals will be able to live a life, the kind of life that modern technology can support. I commend you for the work you are doing in creating in Scotland that kind of dialogue.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction, and you've raised a whole lot of questions which I know my colleagues will want to pursue with you. I also know we are quite short on time this afternoon, so I've asked colleagues to be quite brief in their questions, and hopefully we will get through the list we have before us. Perhaps I could just start by asking in relation to GDP. Are you proposing to replace GDP altogether as a measure of economic success, or do you accept that it still has a role but needs to be complemented with other measures?
We will have to have a measure of market activity, and GDP is that kind of a measure. I want to reemphasize what I said in my remarks. There are some major flaws in the way we measure GDP or market activity. And that's very important. So in particular, one that I emphasize that's important for some small economies is that GDP is a measure of the production inside an economy, not the income of the citizens of the economy. And those two numbers in a closed economy will be the same. But as we have more open economies, they can differ. And a dramatic example is in Ireland, where GDP and GNP have differed markedly because a lot of the economic activity that's supposed to occur in Ireland actually is multinationals, and the income doesn't stay in Ireland. So they get a little cut from taxes, but it's not really enhancing their income. So GDP and GNP are markedly different, and GNP is what I would argue they ought to be focusing on.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. Just one follow-up question, and I'll bring in one of my colleagues. You spoke a lot about inequality and the need to reduce inequality. Do you believe that you can reduce inequality without increasing taxation on those who are better off?
I think that is one important component that ought to be part of a package. In my book, I laid out a fairly comprehensive agenda, 21 items for how we can address inequality. And particularly, I'm more familiar with the tax system in the United States, where we tax speculators at lower rates than we tax people who work for a living. That, what I try to argue, that distorts our economy and increases inequality. There are other things. Taxation is not the only instrument for reducing inequality. One of the things that I was really concerned about in my book is equality of opportunity. And America has become, among the advanced industrial countries, one of the worst in terms of opportunity. Very different from the image of America and it's the American dream. Education is absolutely critical in that. So that's another element. But of course, you can't have good public education without revenues. So the taxes become part of that agenda. And the third thing, just to mention just one more element, that at least in America, and I true of most other advancing countries, one of the major sources of inequality is what I call rent seeking. The notion is that some people get their large income because they've contributed to society, make the pie larger. But a lot of what is going on is efforts to take a larger slice of the pie. You know, when the financial sector and the bankers brought the economy to the brink of ruin, they weren't contributing to a better economy. What they were doing, particularly again in America, predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, manipulating markets, all that is trying to take money from others, not making our economy work better. So these are all examples of how we can simultaneously reduce inequality and make our economy better, perform better.
Thank you. Right. Mike McKenzie.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor. I should first say I thoroughly enjoyed your most recent book, The Price of Inequality, but as I was reading it, I was thinking also of Wilson and Pickett's book, The Spirit Level. You may have read that, I'm not sure. But really what they were able to show in that book was that they could correlate inequality with, not just with a range of social outcomes, but also with GDP per capita. So what they found was where there was least inequality, there was best economic performance in terms of GDP per capita. And the question therefore, and I'll just apologise to my colleagues, you answered my initial question, in fact my initial 5 questions, so I'm on, this is question number 6 in your introduction. So are these mutually exclusive? Does GDP, or certainly GDP per capita, still have some usefulness if we include it with other measures? And is the primary thing we should be focusing on inequality rather than getting too tied up in how we measure it?
Well, one of the things that I emphasized in my introductory remarks is that GDP per capita talks about what's happening on average. But the average person isn't average. And when you have a lot of inequality, it doesn't tell you what's happening to the typical citizen, to your representative voter. And that's what we ought to be focusing more on. So if I had to pick a number, and there's no single number that can capture anything as complex as our economy or our society, if I had to pick a number, I would say median income, median household income, median disposable income. In other words, you want to talk about the person in the middle, which is not the same as the average. So what's been happening in the United States, just to give you a picture, per capita income has been rising. 2009 it went down, but with that exception, it's been going up almost every year. But median income, the typical family in the United States, half above, half below, today is lower than it was in 1996, a decade and a half ago. Median income of a full-time male worker in the United States is lower than it was 40 years ago. So a society which says to the typical worker working full-time, putting all his efforts in, that the income today is the same as it was 40 years ago, is an economy that's not having progress and is not a successful economy. So, people talk America's a great success, everybody, congratulates it, and it has some strong aspects, and you have to commend the innovation, but in terms of delivery to most citizens, it's failed. And that means we ought to have a dialogue in the United States. Why has it failed? What can we do to make it work? And I'm glad that kind of dialogue is beginning to occur in Scotland.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Alison Johnson.
Thank you. And good morning, Professor. The purpose of the Scottish Government, as detailed in their 2011 economic strategy, is to increase sustainable economic growth. And they're measuring this using 7 targets in an effort to broaden measures and to look at progress, including some indication of inequality. But GDP still retains its central place. How appropriate do you feel the Government's framework is for measuring economic progress and well-being? Have we got the balance right between measures of production and well-being? Should the headline indicator in this framework still be GDP? You've spoken yourself of how you prefer GNP. Or do you think there should be an entirely different measurement, taking that central place?
Well, what the Commission recommended was what we call a dashboard approach. As I said before, there's no single number that can capture anything as complex as our society. You want to have a measure of how much resources you have available. Because that will determine what you can spend on education, what you can spend on whatever you decide to spend on. So the resources are an important dimension of the economy, dimension therefore of society. But it doesn't really capture a lot of what is going on. And what I said before, resources are a means to an end. And the end is the better well-being of our citizens. So in the end, you want to begin to think about what is going to be affecting their well-being. That's the thing that you ultimately want to get at. That's a more difficult question, and economists, we don't have as good measure of that. So what I hope will happen as a result of the impetus of the Commission is that there will be work in each society, each country, to try to develop better measures of well-being, of what it means to be well off. In our original report, we identify several of those components, and And some of the work that's going on in Scotland and elsewhere have reinforced the importance of those. Just to mention a couple of them, health is obviously something that's very important. Security is something that's very important. GDP doesn't necessarily capture well either health or security. Just again, I know more about the United States. We have a very inefficient healthcare system that doesn't deliver very well. And so we spend 17% of GDP on health, but the health outcomes, the healthiness of our people are poorer than in the UK and in France and in other countries that spend a lot less. So that's a real example where GDP is not a good measure. Another important dimension that we talked about was connectedness. That it's very important for people to be connected with other people, the nature of the social fabric. And the third that we emphasized is employment. People want to contribute to society in one way or another. And when our economy or society doesn't provide enough jobs, it really it undermines the well-being of citizens. And that's a real concern in Europe and America today, because we are not creating enough jobs.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. Could we in Scotland devise our own indicator that we could use for our own budgetary processes, and how meaningful would that be engaging our progress if it wasn't more widely recognised?
Well, there are, you might think, two separate functions of these metrics. One is to get a benchmark of assessing how well you're doing relative to others. We all need yardsticks to see, are we doing really well? Are we doing poorly? And their standards comparisons become very important. Unfortunately, that's where the comparisons are often very misleading. So, I gave the example before the crisis. A lot of people looked to America and said, look at how good its GDP was. And there were a lot of discussion in other countries. We ought to emulate the United States. And that was a real case. One of the motivations for some of our work on the Commission was, look at the United States was not the model for other countries because it had high inequality, most citizens were not doing well, and it was not sustainable. It was not environmentally sustainable, it was not economically sustainable, and GDP didn't tell you that. So if you were chasing GDP, you were chasing the wrong thing. So yes, comparisons are important, but I just want to emphasize, get the right comparisons. But there's another important purpose. You have to make your own decisions about the direction of your society. There's no reason why Scotland should do exactly the same thing that every other country does. You may want to emphasize more education, more opportunity than other countries. And therefore, you want, if that's what you decide on, it will be important for you to focus measures on opportunity and say, okay, it's okay if we're not doing well in some other measure, if we're doing well on the things that we care about. So as we, as a society, we are going to grade ourselves more on that criteria than others. Let me mention an important initiative that the OECD has done. I think they've really gotten it right. They did some follow-up work on the Work of Commission, and they created a set of indicators. Okay, but what they said is there's no reason why people need to weigh different things the same way. So what they did is they allow different people to come in and say, okay, if you think the environment is more important, you can put a lot of weight on that. If you think inequality is more important, you can put a weight on that. And so while they standardized the metrics in each of the dimensions, they said you can put different weights on these elements to give your own, to create your own report card of your overall performance.
Thank you. Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. Could you tell me what your view is on the Legatum Prosperity Index as a measure of fairness and well-being in countries?
Which
the Legatum Prosperity Index.
I'm not sure I know the detail. There are a lot of indices out, and I don't think I know that, at least not under that name. Do you want to describe it a little bit, or any particular characteristic of it? Let me make a general comment. There are many, UNDP has an index. Each of these puts particular weight on particular things and has both technical issues with them, how they weight different things, and what they include. I and the Commission obviously did not have the time, opportunity to review all the different measures and come to a view on them. It was more looking at the principles.
Okay. If I could just take one measure, you mentioned education in the context of America and inequality. To what extent do you think the American model of university and college education exacerbates inequality in America?
I think it is one of the most important contributors, and it's unfortunately getting worse. Let me just share, I think what is going on in England is a source of concern. Let me explain what the basic issue in the United States is. I mentioned before that median income in the middle, real income, has been stagnating, going down, lower than it was 15 years ago. But meanwhile, the cost of a college education has been going up. It's been going up for two reasons. One, the cost of the inputs have been going up. It's what we call a service sector, requires lots of very skilled workers, and skilled workers' salaries have been going up. But secondly, the state's contribution, the government's contribution to higher education has been going down, markedly so. And the result of that is that tuition in public schools have been soaring in the United States, especially since the beginning of the downturn. Well, with incomes going down and tuition going up, that means that many, many children of poor families will not be able to afford a university education. And you need, in the 21st century, a university education to compete. Now, what used to happen is that students would take out loans. And unfortunately, the burden of those loans has gotten larger and larger. Today in America, student loans are larger than credit card debt. It soared that much. And we then did something that was really bad. We passed a law that said that student debt could not be discharged even in bankruptcy, to provide discouragement for students to take loans. And the consequence is, the average student now graduating from college, the average has over $25,000 of debt. But
those similar concerns.
Over 100,000.
Sorry to interrupt. You have similar concerns about
Sure.
England?
Yes. Yeah. Their tuition has been going up, and that makes it college education less affordable, and student loans can become very oppressive. Now, there are other countries. Australia has designed a good way of getting around it, what they call income contingent loans. So what they do is everybody participates in this program. They lend money to students to pay for their education. Everybody takes out these loans. And then the amount they repay depends on how well the student does. So the education actually delivers a high income. They pay back more. And if they decide they want to go into public service, take a low pay, then the amount they pay back is less. So those who wind up with a high income pay back a larger amount. Those with low income pay a smaller amount. And it's been working, I think, very well. I think that's a model that other countries ought to be considering.
Okay. Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Back to discussion of index again. I'd welcome your view on how Oxfam's Humankind Index approach might help counter the mismatch between people's experience of life and how official statistics describe their situation as noted in the Stiglitz Commission report?
That's right. I think they did a very good job of listing some of the things that what they call the Humankind Index. They listed the things that people in their interviews said were important to them, and they talked about housing, health, living in a neighborhood where you can enjoy going outside and having a clean and healthy environment, work, having satisfying work to do, family, and income was really in the middle of the list. So, and obviously government can't solve all those problems. It can't solve family relationships, but it does play an important role in many of these things, like the environment, like the kinds of communities that we create, like making sure that people have an opportunity for good jobs. So I think it provided an important reminder that money is necessary, but it's not sufficient, and that that government can't solve every problem, but there are things that it can do to make society's well-being and the individual's well-being better off.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Marco Piaggi.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about the very wholesale alternatives to GDP, but when you look at a lot of the things that have been mentioned as indicators of well-being, such as crime rates, having a fulfilling job, health, resource depletion, all of these matters have all got direct economic costs as economists would traditionally understand them. Why do you think economics as a discipline hasn't really kept up?
Well, it's been trying. Some of this, maybe I should tell you a little story. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, I tried to get the U.S. to move to what I call a green GDP, to take the GDP but recognize that we were depleting some of our natural resources, we were engaged in degrading our environment with pollution, and that our success as an economy ought to take into account these negatives. You know, a company, when it wears out machines, takes into account depreciation. And when we use up our resources, we ought to take into account depletion. So at the level of the firm, we do that. But the level of our society, we don't. So it was a small step in, well, I tried, and there was a lot of pushback. Why? Well, what I said before is what we measure affects what we do. If we start thinking about pollution, environmental degradation, we're going to discourage certain kinds of activities. In particular, it would lead us very naturally to say, to think twice about coal. You know, and there's no such thing as clean coal. It's just degrees of dirtiness of coal. And coal, you know, was having all kinds of effects on environmental degradation and greenhouse gases. Well, the coal industry understood that we were onto something important. They understood the importance of this objective of trying to get good measures, and of course that's why they tried to squelch it. And so they did what they could to, they said, if you continue to work on this, we'll take away your funding. And so it really undermined these efforts. So economists have been aware of these problems for some time. This was 20 years ago. But there are, you might say, special interests that are resisting the introduction of these ideas into the, you might say, the mainstream of political discourse.
So you wouldn't...
And I hope Scotland will lead the way in doing this.
So you wouldn't therefore see a role for potentially a baby step approach with a modified form of GDP as being something that might be easier for certain quarters in the debate to swallow. It would actually in some ways be harder.
Well, I think that the basic ideas that I try to articulate, there are many, I call all these baby steps. They're multiple, though. You know, going from GDP to GNP, taking account depletion and resource degradation, looking at inequality, looking at the median rather than the average. These are not big things. These are not revolutionary. We actually have all these tools in our toolkit already. So these are things that we could do right away and put in what I called our dashboard, keeping our vision. And I think there are some more difficult things over the long run, you know, bigger steps. How do we really measure, you know, some of the questions have been about well-being in a broader sense. Incorporating those is going to be more difficult, but we do know some of the elements of those, like unemployment, health, and we can even get some indicators of those things into our dashboard. How we weight that, how we think about that is going to be more difficult, if you understand what I mean. You just can't add them up. They're different dimensions of our society. And that's why I kept emphasizing the importance of a dialogue, because there's not going to be, and this goes back to question about metrics, you're not going to add up easily health, environment, GDP. There's no way you put those numbers together in a single number, and I think it's important to have an array of numbers that you can begin to think about. One analogy that I give that may be helpful: when you're driving, you want to know how much gas is in your gas tank, and you want to know how fast you're going. If you added up two numbers, the gas in your gas tank and how fast you're going, you get a number. But it's a number you don't know what to make out of it. You need both of the numbers to know how to steer what to do in driving your car. And that's what I would urge you to say. Let's not try to get everything into one number. Let's try to look at various dimensions and then talk about, are we not emphasizing the environment enough? Are we not emphasizing inequality enough? Are we not emphasizing employment? You know, so let's have a dialogue over that.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. You talked earlier about the OECD indicators, and I was wondering if that, or indeed something else, could be used as an alternative to GDP as an international indicator, and if so, how would we develop and implement such an index?
What is going on actually internationally are a number of efforts to provide a small set of indicators that would be internationally comparable across countries. Better data for the advanced industrial countries than there are for developing and emerging markets. So the data sets are richer for the developed countries, so you could do a better job comparing the advanced industrial countries. I mentioned before the efforts of the OECD to try to create a set of benchmarks in various areas. To me, the three things that I absolutely essential in a small set of indicators, the narrow economics, and leaving out health and other attributes, incarceration. There are lots of social attributes. The three that I would is some measure of GNP, the income of the citizens, okay, some measure. But when I say some measure, I think we want to include something about environmental degradation, resource depletion, as I said before. We want to take into account something that's going on, not just the conventionally measured market income. The second thing, and let me make one other comment on that, conventional measurement. One of the problems is that we often mismeasure the contribution of government to GDP or GNP. And the reason is that we tend to measure the output in the public sector by the input, because we don't have prices. And so the result of that is that we aren't really assessing the contribution of the public sector to well-being. It distorts our metrics. In effect, we assume that there's no increase in productivity in the public sector. So, for instance, when the public sector, a Social Security program, increases security, that's something that's very valuable. They would have been willing to pay quite a bit for that kind of insurance if the market would provide it, but typically the market doesn't provide good disability insurance, good annuities, and so forth. So that we don't capture the importance that the public sector contributes to our well-being. And so that's a real bias, and it biases our thinking about the importance of what the government can do to enhancing well-being. So that's at least one statistic that I would include. The second statistic that I think is important is some focus. Remember I said before that GDP or GNP is an average. And you want to know what's happening to the representative individual. And that's why I talk about median income, some form of median income. That's an important, it's a measure of inequality, but it's a way of, if you had no inequality, median and average would be the same. When you have a lot of inequality, the two can differ a lot. And when you have growing inequality, the two can move in different directions. So that's why I want to talk about median. And the third number that is very important is a metric, a measure of sustainability. And again, we would like to have measures of environmental, economic, social sustainability, but even in the narrow set, okay, taking a very narrow, economic sustainability is a critical feature. Now, economic sustainability, you have to look at the wealth of the economy, what it's saving, what its increases in its capital stock, its depletion, what it's using up, what it's wearing out, its indebtedness. If a country is borrowing from abroad, its wealth of the citizens is not increasing. So in the United States, if you looked at, as I looked at what was happening in the United States from 2000 to 2007, 2008, I said, the United States is not performing well. Why? Because we were borrowing so much from abroad, we were becoming more and more indebted at the level of the nation, at the level of the government, and at the level of the household. So our wealth was not going up in the way that it should have been. And the wealth that was going up was fake wealth. It was a housing bubble. So it was not going to be sustained. So I came to the view that this was not sustainable economically, not sustainable environmentally, but that's another set of numbers. It was not economically sustainable, and therefore GDP was not telling us how well we were doing.
Thank you. Chick Brody.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor Stiglitz. In the Commission report, the report said it's about measurement rather than policies. In the book that was referred to by my colleague Mike Mackenzie, Wilkinson and Pickett, on the Spirit level, they said different ideologies will, of course, affect not only government policies, but also decisions taken in economic institutions. Now, given somewhat your cynicism regarding the USA and its not applying these measures, how do you see these new measures can be applied in such a way as to support business and funding competitiveness internationally?
As I said, these metrics, these measures are part of our information system, and any information, having good information is absolutely critical for steering an economy. So at the level of the firm, firms want to have a balance sheet because they want to know what their and they have to have income statements. Those are the accounting frameworks that firms use for steering. And when they look at their accounting framework, they will want to know what different divisions are doing, how well their income profits are, and what their balance sheets are. So that's the way firms steer. And in some sense, that's the same thing for the economy. So if, for instance, an economy is growing, but it's growing on the basis of natural resources that are being depleted, that raises the question, is that sustainable? So one of the questions that many people are now asking about the UK was the so-called period of prosperity that they had really a false prosperity, where they took all that income coming in from the North Sea, but rather than investing that in enhancing the human capital and the physical capital and the technical skills, a disproportionate amount of that went elsewhere and didn't create the basis of capital accumulation. So that's where this notion, if you would have careful looking at, you're depleting your natural resources, we're using up our endowment, wealth below the ground is getting less. Are we more than offsetting that by creating wealth above the ground? That should have been at the center of the debate from the beginning of the North Sea gas and oil. And if you had done that, you would have said, well, if we aren't investing above the ground, we're becoming less competitive, because in some sense our wealth is going down. We don't have the productivity, the inputs that will make us competitive with other countries.
Okay. Thank you.
Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, and good morning, Professor. Do you agree that one of the reasons to measure alternatives to GDP is to report publicly on these, so that wider society can relate to how flourishing and prosperous Scotland is, and hopefully become more engaged in the political process?
Oh, very much so. I mean, that's really one of the main points of this, and in a way, when there's a single-minded focus on GDP in a very narrow sense, that leaves it sort of to something that you say, well, we'll leave that to the technocrats, economists. Let the people who know about that manage the economy. And that has led to this kind of set of attitudes that I think have elevated excessively the importance of technocrats in solving our society's problems. The fact is that there are complicated trade-offs that every society faces. How much emphasis do we put on the creation of employment? I think that's a lot. We ought to be putting a lot on. The technocrats, people at the ECB never talk about that as the critical factor. They say just inflation, you cure inflation, and that means the economy is going to work well. So they've tried to depict a situation where there aren't all these choices that societies have. And by focusing on the many dimensions of what constitutes well-being, I hope that we will contribute to this kind of a discussion, will contribute to a broader dialogue in society.
Thank you. Can I continue?
Follow up, yes?
Yes. If I could just follow up, because I think you are on the same line of thought. Would it then be beneficial to report on 2 or 3 headline measures, such as, for example, the security of employment, quality of the local environment, and equality measures, which would be more comprehensible to the people and at the same time as GDP, rather than one alternative aggregated measure?
Say the basic framework of having benchmarks, and in response to one of the earlier questions, Scotland's benchmarks don't necessarily have to be the same as some other countries. And some of these benchmarks can be, I would say, exploration, something that Scotland might want to explore, and other countries haven't yet done that. I think one of the things that certainly affects many Americans right now is a sense of insecurity. GDP could go up and insecurity go up. And if you ask what affects people's well-being, a high sense of insecurity is really bad. And we're talking about all kinds of insecurity: health insecurity, economic insecurity, job insecurity, physical insecurity, environmental insecurity. So I would, one of the things that we've, in some of the follow-up work of the Commission, is beginning to think about how do we try to capture this notion of insecurity, because that is something that people really do care about. Another one is a sense of community. There's a lot of evidence that community is important for individual sense of well-being, connectedness. And we can there are measures of some of these things. They're imperfect, but what we forgot is GDP is not a perfect measure of output. We've just used it for so long that we've forgotten all the imperfections and all the blemishes. When it was first being created, everybody was they debated it, and they were very much aware of all the blemishes. You use it for long enough, and you just forget about all those blemishes. But sometimes those blemishes turn out to be very important.
Thank you.
We're getting towards the end of our time. Probably the last question coming, I think, from Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Convener. Actually, thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for joining us today. You started off by saying that the National Performance Framework is a very welcome measure here in Scotland, although I think you said just the fact that it exists is perhaps its biggest contribution at the moment. You've also focused on median household income. Median household income, the last available figures in Scotland show it's fallen by £1,200. So it just suggests the difficulty between the practical reality of what's happening in Scotland and perhaps some of the steps we are taking or not taking to counter it. Can I just ask you to suggest what practical measures we could now take to move away from GDP, to actually use more practical measures, practical indices that include well-being, that would actually make a difference to the way we run our economy and our government?
Well, one of the things, as I say, is exactly what you said. A focus on median rather than average starts having you focus on what's happening to the average citizen. So it's not just, we jokingly say, if the upper 1% in the United States does better, it's nice for them. But if it doesn't affect the rest of our society, are we actually having a society that's working? Again, I don't mean to keep coming back to the United States, but just one statistic that's very telling in the United States: 120% of the increase in income in the United States for the last 2 years went to the top 1%. That meant all the increase went to the top 1%, and everybody else was worse off. Now, when something like that is going on, you should be worried as a government. Something is failing. Now, that's a complicated diagnostic of figuring out what is failing. And that's why you need other things. Is it employment? That's one of the variables that I would include as an important metric in my, say, dashboard. Is it wages? Are the wages of the people in the middle falling behind? And if so, what is the reason for that? Are we failing to give people the skills that they need to compete? And so that then relates to education. So what I want to do is to come back in a way to the point I made in the introduction, that our metrics are part of our information system for steering the economy. And if you're a doctor, as you start doing your diagnosis, you start asking questions. Well, for this patient, I need to run another test. You need to get more data to sort of separate this diagnosis versus that diagnosis. Okay? So I think the same thing for your country. As you start to think about where are your problems, what are the things that are a problem, you will start to say, let's look more carefully. And I think the answer is you're going to look more carefully at your education system, you'll look more carefully at your wages, look more carefully at your system of employment, job creation. Then next starts is, what are the impediments to job creation? Your financial system. Is your financial system delivering capital to small businesses? Is it, or is it engaged in manipulating LIBOR? Or, you know, what kinds of activity?
Professor Stiglitz, can I just ask a brief supplementary, simply because your contribution to Scotland at the moment is quite important, just not only in terms of this debate, the indices of well-being, but also your comments about moving away from austerity economics and perhaps producing a fiscal growth. And also, clearly, you're heavily involved in the Fiscal Commission in Scotland. Can I just ask you on that, your recommendation that Scotland should have a currency union with the rest of the UK, is that something that you think is essential for an independent Scotland?
Well, let me just say, the report that came out was a report of the collectivity of the group. We didn't each agree on on the weight associated with every recommendation. There were some, like any group report, it's a sense of the group with differences. But for the report to have meaning, what we all said, there's nothing that we felt was so outrageous that we wanted to write a dissent to. So it's a broad consensus, but we don't all have the same weight. Let me say that one of the things that was very important on that particular issue was a discussion of transition versus the long run. There was a concern of what were the factors that might make for a smoother transition, but there's also a discussion of, over the long run, Scotland will have to re-examine the institutions that it has, and it will be important to have a structure that has the flexibility that as time evolves, the institutions will be able to adapt to the change in circumstances. So I think as you think about that issue, I think the two notions that at least were very influential is the smoothness of transition and the flexibility to move eventually to the institutional structure that will be appropriate for Scotland.
Okay, Professor Stiglitz, I'm sorry, our time has gone, and we are now in danger of breaching parliamentary process by sitting at the same time as the parliamentary chamber is sitting. So I'm very sorry, but we're going to have to cut you off in mid-flow at this point. I'm very grateful to you for giving your time up to the committee today, and we'll be following up this piece of work with great interest. So thank you very much on behalf of the committee members.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm getting in trouble for that one.